Forget the simple story of Thanksgiving you were told. The real beginning of America was not a peaceful dinner. It was a brutal, desperate scramble for a continent, driven by fantasy, greed, and catastrophic failure. Long before the Pilgrims, Spanish conquistadors were marching across the American heartland, hunting for ghosts. They chased a mythical fountain of youth into Florida and found only death. They searched for 7 cities of gold across the deserts of Arizona, only to find mud huts. One expedition, shipwrecked on the coast of Texas, was reduced from 600 men to just 4, forced to walk 6,000 miles as slaves and healers. Another carved a trail of iron through the southeast, a bloody march that unleashed plagues and destroyed entire civilizations. And while the English at Jamestown famously descended into cannibalism during their starving time, the first permanent city in America wasn't English at all. It was St. Augustine, a Spanish military fortress built in blood not for freedom, but to fight the French. This is the story of how a continent was truly discovered, through illusion, desperation, and conflict. This is the contested continent. The contested continent, Spain's footprint in the first settlements, the Queen's Gamble, a new world on the horizon. The year is 1492. In the chambers of the Alhambra Palace in Granada, the air is thick with the scent of old parchment and the lingering tension of a recently concluded war. Queen Isabella I of Castile, her mind a fortress of political calculation and fervent faith, has just given her final assent to a most unusual proposal. A Genoese navigator, intense and almost messianic in his conviction, has convinced her of the impossible, that one can reach the fabled riches of the East by sailing west. This, of course, was the first gamble. It was a roll of the dice against all conventional wisdom, a speculative venture on a man, Christopher Columbus, whom most royal courts had dismissed as a fanatic. When his 3 small ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, vanished over the western horizon, Spain held its breath. When Columbus returned, he brought not the silks and spices of Cathay, but a handful of frightened, bronze-skinned people, strange parrots, and a small quantity of gold. He declared he had found the Indies, the outskirts of Asia. For Queen Isabella and her husband, King Ferdinand of Aragon, this was a triumph. They had beaten their rivals, the Portuguese, to the great prize. Or so they thought. This is the story most of us know. But it is not the real story. The real story begins in the years after this first, triumphant return. The real story is about the second gamble. A gamble far larger, more complex, and ultimately more consequential than the first. It was a gamble taken not on a single man, but on an idea. That the few islands Columbus had touched were merely the doorstep to a new and boundless world. The initial euphoria of 1492 quickly gave way to a cold, hard reality. Columbus's subsequent voyages, larger and better funded, failed to produce the promised mountains of gold or the bustling trade ports of the Great Khan. Instead, they revealed more islands, more Indians, and more hardship. The new Spanish colonists on Hispaniola and Cuba found themselves in a disorienting, fever-ridden world. The gold they could find was alluvial, panned painstakingly from rivers not found in great treasuries. The native Taino people, forced into a brutal system of labor called the encomienda, were dying in catastrophic numbers, succumbing to European diseases against which they had no defense. This was not the East. This was not Japan. This was something else. In the counting houses of Seville and the royal chambers of Spain, a new and unsettling map of the world was being drawn. It was a map defined not by what was known but by what was in the way. The reports of other explorers, the Italian Amerigo Vespucci, who sailed for both Spain and Portugal, and the Portuguese expeditions charting the coast of Brazil, all pointed to the same staggering conclusion. This was not a collection of Asian islands. This was a mundus novus, a new world, a colossal, previously unknown continent that blocked the western path to Asia. For Spain, this revelation was both a crushing disappointment and a world-altering opportunity. The great obstacle, as this new continent was sometimes called, might not be the route to the spices, but perhaps it held treasures of its own, treasures to rival and even surpass those of the East. This is where the Queen's gamble truly begins. It was a strategic geopolitical decision, born of intense rivalry. In 1494, with the blessing of Pope Alexander VI, Spain and Portugal had effectively divided the entire non-Christian world between them, with the Treaty of Tordesillas. An imaginary line drawn down the Atlantic gave everything to its west to Spain, and everything to its east to Portugal. This treaty transformed exploration from a private venture into an arm of the state. Every ship that sailed, every man who set foot on a new shore was not just an explorer but an agent of the crown, claiming land by right of papal decree. And the Portuguese were moving fast. They were rounding Africa, opening the sea route to the real India and establishing a global spice empire. They had even, by landing on the coast of Brazil, laid claim to a piece of the New World itself. Spain was in a race. The gamble was no longer just about finding gold. It was about possession. It was about planting the Spanish flag on as much of this new continent as possible, before the Portuguese, or the emergent English and French who ignored the Pope's treaty, could. The Caribbean islands, now dotted with burgeoning, desperate settlements like Santo Domingo, became the staging ground for this new phase. They were laboratories of conquest. On Hispaniola and Cuba, a generation of men was forged. These were not the noble knights of the Reconquista, the war against the Moors in Spain. These were conquistadors, hardened, ambitious, and often ruthless men. They were second sons with no inheritance, veterans with no wars to fight, and commoners seeking to become lords. They had learned how to survive in this new, hostile environment. They had learned how to fight the native peoples, how to manage plantations, and above all, how to listen for rumors, and the air was thick with rumors. The Taino and Carib survivors, their cultures crumbling, were a source of endless tantal entry. They told the Spanish what they wanted to hear, or perhaps told them tales that were, in their own way, true. They spoke of Bimini, a land to the north, a place of great wealth. This name, passed through the filter of European legend, would soon morph into a myth of a restorative fountain, a fountain of youth. For the aging conquistadors, many of whom had spent decades in the tropics, the promise of restored vitality was as tantalizing as gold. Other rumors, filtering up from the south and west, were even more potent. Tales of Antilia, the 7 cities of gold, a legend dating back to the Moorish invasion of Portugal, were suddenly revived. Surely in a world this vast and strange, such a golden kingdom must exist. As Spanish ships probed the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, they heard whispers from coastal tribes about a vast, rich empire in the interior, tales that would, in time, lead Hernán Cortés to the gold-drenched capital of the Aztecs. But for the men in Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, the most immediate and tempting mystery lay directly to the north. Just beyond the horizon, past the Bahamas, lay a vast, uncharted coastline. It was a land the local tribes called Calcio. The Spanish had a different name for it, a name given in passing by an earlier slaving vessel that had sighted it. They called it Tierra Firme, the mainland. It was this northern mainland, the land that would one day become the United States, that represented the next logical step in Spain's grand unfolding gamble. The Caribbean was the known world. This new land was the great unknown, and so the stage was set. The Queen's gamble on Columbus had unlocked a new world. But it was the next generation's gamble, the ambition of men like Juan Ponce de León, the wealthy and battle-hardened governor of Puerto Rico, that would push the boundaries of Spanish power. They were driven by a toxic, powerful cocktail of motives: a hunger for gold, a quest for personal glory, a desire to claim new lands for their king, and a fervent, often contradictory, mission to spread the Catholic faith to the heathens they would inevitably enslave. The islands of the Caribbean were the first chapter, a bloody and tragic preface. Now these men stood on the shores of Puerto Rico and Cuba, their armor rusting in the humid air, and stared north. They stared at that hazy green-black line on the horizon, a line that promised everything: riches, eternal youth, new kingdoms to conquer, and new souls to save. It was a new world, a new frontier. And as the second decade of the 16th century dawned, the first ships were being prepared, the first crews being mustered, to make the leap from the known islands to the unknown continent. The Queen's gamble was about to enter its most dangerous and defining phase. The European story of North America was about to begin. The fountain of myth, Ponce de León and the Florida frontier. The first gamble was complete. The Spanish crown, through its agents in the Caribbean, had established a foothold in the New World. The islands of Hispaniola, Puerto Rico and Cuba were now Spanish fortresses, brutal laboratories of colonization where fortunes were made and countless lives were destroyed. From these islands, a generation of hardened men, the conquistadors, looked north, their ambition unquenched, their ears filled with the whispers of legends. Among these men, one stood as a titan. His name was Juan Ponce de León. Ponce de León was not a desperate newcomer. He was the embodiment of the successful conquistador. He had sailed with Columbus on his second voyage in 1493. He had brutally pacified the Taino of Hispaniola, and he had conquered and been named the first governor of Puerto Rico, a position that made him fabulously wealthy. By 1512, he was a man in his late 30s, an old man by the standards of the New World frontier. He had gold, he had estates, he had power, but he was also a man adrift. He had been pushed out of his governorship in Puerto Rico by political rivals, namely the son of Christopher Columbus. A man of his stature and ambition could not simply retire. He needed a new project, a new kingdom to conquer. He needed more, and the Caribbean was a sea of myths. For years the Spanish had heard tales from the Taino and Carib peoples. The Taino spoke of a land to the northwest, an island called Bimini. In some versions, Bimini was a land of great wealth. In others, it was a place of restoration, home to a miraculous spring or river that could reverse the ravages of age. This indigenous legend found fertile soil in the European mind. For centuries, medieval European folklore had contained its own version of this story: the Fountain of Youth, a mythical spring that granted eternal life, a tale woven into the romances of Alexander the Great and the travels of Sir John Mandeville. In the fevered, disorienting reality of the New World, a place where everything seemed possible, these two separate myths, one Taino, one European, merged. They became a single tantalizing obsession. For an aging, displaced conquistador like Ponce de León, the allure was irresistible. It was a quest that promised the three things a man of his time craved: oro, gloria, y evangelio, gold, glory, and the gospel. Gold in the form of a new, wealthy land. Glory in the form of discovering a new domain for his king and a legendary miracle. And the gospel, the royal and religious justification for claiming any new land he found. In 1512, Ponce de León used his vast wealth and political connections to secure a royal contract, an asiento from King Ferdinand. The contract was a license to discover and settle the fabled island of Bimini. It made no official mention of a fountain. The primary objective, as always, was to find land and gold, and to claim it for Spain before any rivals did. But the legend, the personal motivation, hung heavy in the tropical air. On March 4, 1513, Ponce de León set sail from Puerto Rico. His expedition was a small, private venture, funded from his own pocket. He commanded 3 ships, including his flagship, the Santiago. They were manned by professional sailors, adventurous settlers, and at least 1 priest. They sailed northwest, skillfully navigating the treacherous shoals of the Bahamas, the islands Columbus had first encountered. But Ponce de León was looking beyond them. He was hunting for the mainland. For weeks they plied the turquoise waters, finding nothing but small cays and empty ocean. Then on March 27, 1513, they sighted it. It was not a small island. It was a long, low, green-black coastline stretching as far as the eye could see in either direction. This was a tierra firme, a mainland. They had found the northern continent. Ponce de León, however, still believed it was a very large island. For several days they sailed north along its coast, battling a fierce unknown current that pushed them back. This was the first European encounter with the mighty Gulf Stream, the ocean river that would become the vital, high-speed highway for Spanish treasure fleets returning to Europe. On April 2, 1513, needing fresh water and repairs, Ponce de León ordered his ships to anchor. He was rowed ashore, planted the royal standard of Castile and León in the sand, and claimed the entire land for Spain. It was the Easter season, a holy time known in Spanish as Pascua Florida, the Feast of Flowers. Looking around, Ponce de León saw a land of astonishing biological vibrancy, a subtropical landscape bursting with green foliage and colorful blossoms. The name was obvious. He christened the land La Florida. This moment, this first official European claim on the mainland of the future United States, was not peaceful. Ponce de León's assumption of ownership was immediately challenged by the people who already lived there. His first contacts with the native inhabitants, likely the Ais or the Timucua, were cautious, but they quickly turned violent. These were not the Taino of the islands, already decimated by decades of Spanish rule. These were warrior societies, confident and fiercely territorial. They saw the Spanish as invaders, not gods, and they met the Spaniards' steel swords with fire-hardened arrows. Unable to establish a peaceful foothold, Ponce de León sailed south, charting the coastline. He rounded the chain of islands he named Los Martires, the Martyrs, because the jagged rocks looked to him like men suffering in agony. He explored the southwestern coast, perhaps as far north as modern-day Charlotte Harbor, where he once again clashed, this time with the formidable Calusa tribe. The Calusa warriors, paddling massive war canoes, attacked his ships with such ferocity that the Spanish were forced to retreat. After nearly 6 months of exploration, Ponce de León returned to Puerto Rico. He had not found a fountain. He had not found gold. He had not found a new world populated by docile natives. Instead, he had found a land of astonishing beauty and terrible danger. He had put La Florida on the map, but what of the Fountain of Youth? The story that defines him? This is the great central irony of his life. In his own lifetime, Ponce de León was not known as the seeker of the fountain. His official reports did not mention it. Contemporary chroniclers barely noted it. The story was for the most part a rumor, a bit of colonial gossip. The legend was, in fact, a political smear, invented after his death. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, a rival chronicler who disliked Ponce de León, wrote a history of the Indies decades later. He seized upon the Bimini rumor and amplified it, painting Ponce de León as a vain, foolish, and credulous old man, chasing a magical cure for his impotence. It was a character assassination so brilliant, so perfectly simple that it stuck. The joke became the history. The legend consumed the man. The real Ponce de León was not a fool. He was a pragmatic, ruthless, and ambitious man. He returned to Spain a hero, was knighted by the king, and was given the grand new title of adelantado, a royal military governor of both Bimini and Florida. His new official mission was not to explore, but to colonize. It took him 8 years to assemble his new expedition. He was delayed by royal duties, by fighting the Caribs, and by the sheer difficulty of raising funds for a land that had, so far, produced nothing but hostile natives and mosquito swarms. Finally, in 1521, Ponce de León returned to Florida. This was not a small exploratory probe. This was a full-scale colonization fleet. 2 ships, 200 men, priests to convert the natives, farmers to till the soil, and 50 horses. He landed on the same western coast near Charlotte Harbor, the heart of Calusa territory. The Calusa had not forgotten the Spanish, and in the 8 years since his first voyage, they had likely encountered other Spaniards, slavers, and shipwrecked sailors, and had learned to hate them. They gave the new colony no quarter. Almost from the moment the Spanish landed, they were under attack. They tried to build a settlement to plant their crops, but they were besieged. In one of many desperate skirmishes in the mud and mangroves, Juan Ponce de León, the great adelantado of Florida, the conqueror of Puerto Rico, was struck in the thigh by a Calusa arrow. The wound, likely from an arrow tip dipped in the poison of the manchineel tree, quickly became infected. The colony collapsed. The mission was a catastrophic failure. His men, carrying their mortally wounded leader, abandoned Florida and sailed for Havana, Cuba. There, Juan Ponce de León, the first European to claim and name the land, died in agony. He had not found eternal youth. He had found death on the frontier he had hoped to conquer. He left behind no permanent settlement, no gold, and no fountain. All he left was a name on a map and a legend that would, ironically, grant him a different kind of immortality. He had opened the door to the mainland, and in doing so had become the first in a long line of Europeans to discover that the new continent would not be so easily tamed. Shipwrecked and Reborn, the unbelievable odyssey of Cabeza de Vaca, the land La Florida, had already proven itself a phantom. It had lured Juan Ponce de León with a myth and had given him only death. But in the court of Spain, the allure of the unknown is a fire that once lit cannot be easily extinguished. The failure of one man only serves to inflame the ambition of the next. Enter Pánfilo de Narváez. If Ponce de León was a capable conquistador who met a tragic end, Narváez was a man defined by his failures. He was tall, red-bearded, and possessed an arrogance as vast as the continent he sought to conquer. His reputation was already tarnished. Years earlier in Mexico, he had been sent to arrest Hernán Cortés, but was instead defeated, captured, and lost an eye in the process. Now in 1527 he had been given his own grand prize, a chance to redeem his name. He was named Adelantado of La Florida, a royal patent to conquer and settle the entire coastline from the tip of the peninsula to the rivers of Mexico. His expedition was a monster. 5 ships, 600 men, soldiers, settlers, priests, and their wives. It was a mission of colonization, and among its ranks, serving as the expedition's treasurer and royal sheriff, was a man whose name would be remembered long after Narváez was forgotten. Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. The venture was cursed from the start. A hurricane in Cuba destroyed 2 ships and killed 60 men before they had even begun. Finally, in April of 1528, Narvaez and his remaining 5 ships, carrying about 400 men, dropped anchor near a wide, shallow bay on the western coast of Florida, likely Tampa Bay. They went ashore. They found a small empty native village. Inside one of the huts they found a single small tantalizing object, a gold rattle. 'Twas all the proof Narvaez needed. The rumors were true. This land held treasure. The local natives, when captured, pointed north. Appalachian, they said. Appalachian was the source. It was a great city, a place of immense wealth. This was the same siren song the Spanish had heard across the New World, the same rumor that led from one disappointment to the next. And here, Narvaez made the single most disastrous decision in the history of American exploration. He looked at his ships, his only lifeline, and he looked at the impenetrable green wall of the Florida interior. And he decided to split his forces. He ordered 300 men, including himself and Cabeza de Vaca, to march north to find this golden city. His ships, with the remaining 100 people, were to sail the coast and find a suitable harbor where they would rendezvous. It was a plan of breathtaking ignorance. They had no maps. They had no idea of the geography. The ships and the land party would never see each other again. Cabeza de Vaca, in his official capacity as treasurer, vigorously protested. He argued that they were marching into the unknown without supplies, leaving their ships without a pilot and without any certainty. He argued that they were marching to their own doom. Narvaez publicly insulted him, called him a coward, and gave the order to march. On May 1st, 1528, the 300 men turned their backs to the sea and walked into the green hell of the Florida wilderness. Their journey was a nightmare. This was not the open land of Spain. It was a landscape of swamps, dense forests, and wide, fast-flowing rivers. Their armor rusted, their supplies rotted. They were starving, reduced to eating the very horses they had brought for war. And they were not alone. The native peoples, the Timucua, were not passive. They used the landscape as a weapon, launching silent, lightning-fast raids from the cover of the swamps, firing long, powerful arrows that could punch through Spanish mail. After 2 months of suffering, they found it. Appalachian. It was not a city of gold. It was a modest village of 40 mud and thatch huts near modern-day Tallahassee. The Appalachian warriors were the fiercest they had yet encountered. For 25 days, the Spanish occupied the empty village, besieged, starving and demoralized as the Appalachian burned the huts around them. The golden dream was dead. The only thought now was survival. Broken, sick, and haunted, Narvaez led his men on a desperate march south, back to the sea, hoping to find their ships. They reached the coast at what is now St. Mark's, Florida, but the sea was empty. There were no ships. They were trapped. Hundreds of miles from any Spanish settlement, surrounded by hostile forces, with no food and no way home. It was here that an almost insane plan was born. They would build their own ships and sail to Mexico. They had no tools, no materials, no shipwrights, but they had desperation. They forged a bellows from a hollow log and deerskins. They melted their stirrups, their crossbows, their spurs, and their swords, forging the very symbols of their conquest into nails, saws, and axes. They cut down the forest, using palmetto husks for fiber and pine resin for pitch. They killed their remaining horses, eating the meat and using the hides to make water skins. They sewed their own shirts together to make sails. For 40 days they labored, a starving skeletal crew, while being constantly harassed by native attacks. Finally, they produced 5 crude overloaded barges. On September 22, 1528, 242 men, all that remained of the 300, crammed themselves onto these fragile vessels. They were so low in the water their gunwales were barely inches above the waves. They set off, sailing west, hoping to follow the coast to the Spanish settlement at Panuco in Mexico. The voyage was a slow-motion catastrophe. They had no water. The horsehide bags rotted and the water turned foul. They were battered by storms, plagued by dehydration. The rafts were separated. One by one they were lost. Narvaez, in his raft, saw some of Cabeza de Vaca's men struggling and refused to help, shouting that it was every man for himself. Narvaez's own raft was later blown out to sea, and he was never heard from again. On November 6, 1528, the barge commanded by Cabeza de Vaca, half filled with water and carrying men who were unconscious from starvation, washed ashore. They had been cast onto a sandy, barren island, likely near modern-day Galveston, Texas. Cabeza de Vaca, looking at their wretched state, named it La Isla de Malhado, the Isle of Misfortune. They were met by the local Karankawa Indians. The Spanish, naked, starving, and freezing, were so pathetic that they began to weep. The Karankawa, seeing these strange, bearded men in such a state, sat down with them and began to weep as well. This was the moment of rebirth. The conquistador was dead. The 300 proud men of Narvaez's army were gone. The survivors were now fewer than 80, scattered on the coast. That first winter, disease and starvation scythed through them. Of the men on Cabeza de Vaca's raft, only a handful survived. For the next 6 years, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca ceased to be a Spanish nobleman. He became something else. He was a slave, a servant to the Karankawa. He dug for roots, he carried firewood. He experienced a level of hardship and humility that no European of his status had ever known. He adapted. He learned their language. He learned their customs. He eventually found a new role. He became a trader, a neutral party who could move between warring tribes, carrying shells, beads, and flints. This gave him a freedom of movement, and it allowed him to search. He was searching for other survivors, and one by one he found them. There was Alonso del Castillo, Andrés Dorantes, and Dorantes' enslaved Moroccan, a black man named Estebanico. These were the last 4, the only 4 survivors of the entire 300-man land expedition. In 1534, after 6 years of servitude, the 4 men made their escape. They fled inland, heading west. They had no weapons, no armor, and no idea where they were. They were simply moving away from the coast toward the setting sun, toward Mexico, and then the unbelievable happened. They were brought to a village where men were sick with a malady of the head. The tribe begged these 4 strange men to heal them. Castillo and Dorantes were terrified, but Cabeza de Vaca, a man of deep faith, remembered his scripture. He improvised. He made the sign of the cross over the sick men. He recited a Pater Noster and an Ave Maria, and he prayed to God for their recovery. The next day, the men awoke healed. Word spread like a wildfire across the prairies. These 4 men, 3 white, 1 black, were not men. They were children of the sun, powerful shamans, divine healers. For the next 2 years, the 4 men walked. Their journey was no longer a desperate flight. It was a holy procession. They were passed from one tribe to the next, revered by all. An entourage of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of native people followed them. They would arrive at a village, perform their healings, and be given gifts: food, robes of bison hide, turquoise, and coral. They were the first Europeans to see the vast humpbacked cows of the plains, the American bison. They were the first to cross Texas, the first to see the Rio Grande, the first to cross the deserts of northern Mexico. This was the first European glimpse into the heart of the North American continent. And it was a glimpse not of conquest, but of total dependent immersion. Then, in the spring of 1536, in what is now the Mexican state of Sinaloa, they saw a a Spanish-made belt buckle worn by a native. They wept. They were close. Soon after they found them, 4 Spanish horsemen on a slaving expedition. The slavers were frozen in shock. Before them stood a skeletal, sun-blackened, bearded white man, flanked by 2 others and a black man, all dressed in native skins, speaking perfect 16th century Castilian. But the shock was mutual. Cabeza de Vaca looked at his countrymen, and he saw them chaining up the very native people who had for months revered and guided him. A profound confrontation occurred. Cabeza de Vaca, the wild man, demanded that the slavers, the civilized men, release his native followers. The slavers, baffled and angry, eventually relented, intimidated by his strange authority. In July 1536, 8 years after he had marched into Florida, and 10 years after he had left Spain, Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca arrived in Mexico City. Of the 600 who set out, 4 returned. He had walked over 6,000 miles. His story, which he wrote down in a report for the king called La Relación, was an unbelievable odyssey of suffering, adaptation, and spiritual transformation. But in one of history's greatest ironies, his tale of survival would be read by others as a treasure map. Because in his report, Cabeza de Vaca mentioned the rumors he had heard, rumors of great cities to the north, places with turquoise and gold. The Narvaez expedition was a total disaster, but its echoes, carried in the incredible story of the 4 who lived, would set the stage for the next, even larger, invasions of the American Southwest. A trail of iron, De Soto's bloody march through the Southeast, the whispers of gold carried back to Mexico City by the emaciated but miraculous Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and his companions, ignited a new fever. Their tale, a horrifying odyssey of survival, was misinterpreted by many as a tantalizing promise. If 4 men stripped bare could hear tales of rich cities in the north, what could a well-equipped army find? Spain, now flush with the staggering gold and silver from the conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires, was ready to send not just explorers, but conquerors. The next man to answer the call was one of the greatest and most brutal of them all, Hernando de Soto. De Soto was no stranger to conquest. He was a veteran of the brutal pacification of Central America, and crucially, a key lieutenant to Francisco Pizarro during the conquest of the Inca Empire in Peru. He had been there in Cajamarca when Pizarro captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa. He had received a vast share of Atahualpa's ransom, enough gold and silver to make him one of the wealthiest men in Spain. He had his estates, his noble wife, his grand house in Seville. He had, unlike Ponce de León or Narvaez, already achieved immense glory and unimaginable wealth. But for a man like De Soto, wealth was merely the fuel for greater ambition. He was in his late 30s, driven by an insatiable hunger for even more glory, for a kingdom of his own. Cabeza de Vaca's stories, though warning against the very idea of a land invasion, were twisted into an invitation. De Soto believed that La Florida held another Peru, another golden empire waiting to be discovered. In 1537, De Soto secured a royal commission. He was granted the governorship of Cuba and the title of Adelantado of La Florida, with the right to conquer, settle, and exploit all lands north of Mexico that he could claim for Spain. This was no ramshackle private venture. This was a state-sponsored invasion, one of the largest ever launched into North America. In April 1538, De Soto set sail from Spain with a fleet of 9 ships, over 600 soldiers, 200 horses, a herd of pigs for food, dozens of specialized servants, blacksmiths, armorers, priests, and even a physician. These were the flower of Spanish military might, equipped with the finest steel, gunpowder, and war horses Europe could provide. After a year of preparations in Cuba, De Soto's expedition landed on the western coast of Florida in May 1539, likely at Tampa Bay, the same fateful spot where Narvaez had made his catastrophic blunder 11 years earlier. But unlike Narvaez, De Soto was in command of a formidable, disciplined fighting force. His first act upon landing was to secure a local guide. He found him in a man named Juan Ortiz, a survivor of the Narvaez expedition, who had been captured by the Uzita tribe and lived as an enslaved man among them for 10 years. Ortiz, fluent in the local languages, became De Soto's invaluable interpreter, the crucial link between the Spanish and the complex chiefdoms of the Southeast. De Soto's strategy was simple: intimidation and exploitation. He marched his army through Florida, using captured chiefs as human shields and hostages, demanding food, porters, and information about gold. He was seeking a large, centralized empire like the Aztecs or Incas, a single powerful ruler whose treasury he could plunder. But the Southeast was different. It was a region of powerful hierarchical chiefdoms, complex agricultural societies like the Timucua, Apalache, Coosa, and Cofitachequi, but no single empire. His journey was a trail of iron and blood. From Florida, he moved north into what is now Georgia, then west through the Carolinas, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. He was constantly pursuing rumors, always just one more village, one more river, one more tribe away from the fabled gold. Each interaction with a native chiefdom was a delicate dance that almost invariably ended in violence. If a chief refused to provide porters or food, De Soto would burn their village, seize their women, and unleash his war dogs, the Spanish horses, the arquebuses, early firearms, and the steel weapons were devastatingly effective against indigenous warriors armed with bows and arrows. But the native forces, despite their technological disadvantage, were fierce and relentless. De Soto's men were constantly ambushed, picked off by arrows, and harassed. They lost men, horses, and precious supplies. The turning point came in October 1540 at the fortified town of Mobila, likely near present-day Selma, Alabama. De Soto had captured the powerful chief Tuscaloosa, a giant of a man, and attempted to coerce him into providing porters. Tuscaloosa, however, had secretly gathered a vast army of warriors. When De Soto marched his army into Mobila, they were ambushed. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles in early American history. Thousands of native warriors poured out of the huts, unleashing a storm of arrows. The Spanish were caught completely by surprise. For hours, they fought desperately, trapped within the palisade walls, suffering terrible casualties. De Soto eventually managed to rally his men, and with their superior weapons and tactics, they launched a counterattack. They set fire to the town, burning thousands of warriors alive. The Spanish won Mobila, but at a terrible cost. They lost 20 men killed, and almost all the rest were wounded. 45 horses were killed. Hundreds of slaves and baggage were lost in the fire. The native losses were catastrophic, estimated at between 2,500 and 3,000 warriors killed. But the battle was a Pyrrhic victory. De Soto's men were demoralized, their supplies ruined, and their armor shattered. Many wanted to turn south to the coast where they knew ships were waiting to resupply them. But De Soto refused. He feared that if his men reached the coast and saw the chance to abandon the mission, they would take it. His gold fever was too strong. He still believed stubbornly that the great empire lay just beyond the next horizon. He turned his back on the sea and marched his wounded, suffering army further inland to the northwest, into what is now northern Mississippi. The winter of 1540-41 was brutal. They were constantly attacked by the Chickasaw, a resilient and determined people. One night, the Chickasaw launched a surprise attack, setting fire to the Spanish camp and killing 12 soldiers and 50 horses. The Spanish were left with only a handful of mounts. their most crucial advantage. By May 1541, the starving, exhausted remnants of De Soto's army reached a sight that no European had ever witnessed. A vast, muddy, turbulent river, flowing south with immense power. This was the Rio Grande del Espíritu Santo, the great river of the Holy Spirit. Today we know it as the Mississippi River. De Soto had discovered it, in the sense that he was the first European to document its existence. His men spent a month building barges to cross it, all while battling the local Quapaw people who fiercely defended their territory. On the western bank of the Mississippi, De Soto's relentless search for gold continued, pushing his men through Arkansas, Oklahoma, and possibly even Texas. But the land offered no cities of gold, only more villages, more food, and more resistance. The terrain became increasingly difficult, the native peoples even more dispersed and hostile. By the spring of 1542, the expedition was on its last legs. They had lost hundreds of men. Their supplies were gone. Their horses were dying. Juan Ortiz, their invaluable interpreter, had passed away, leaving the Spanish deaf and mute in a hostile land. De Soto himself, exhausted and demoralized, fell ill with a fever. On May 21, 1542, Hernando de Soto, the wealthy conqueror of Peru, died on the banks of the Mississippi River, far from any gold or glory. His men, fearing that the native populations would desecrate his body if they found it, wrapped him in cloaks, weighted him with sand, and secretly buried him in the depths of the very river he had discovered. His death left his army leaderless, lost, and utterly broken. Luis de Moscoso Alvarado, De Soto's second-in-command, took over. Instead of attempting to march overland to Mexico, a journey they knew would be impossible without a guide, he decided to build more barges and try to sail down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. It took them another year, battling river currents, native attacks, and starvation. The remaining 311 survivors finally reached the Gulf and then sailed along the Texas coast, miraculously making it back to Spanish Mexico in September 1543. They returned as ghosts, their faces gaunt, their clothing tattered, their dreams of gold replaced by a lifetime of horror. De Soto's expedition was a catastrophic military and economic failure. It found no gold, established no permanent settlements, and brought Spain no lasting territorial gains in the southeast. But its impact on the native populations was immeasurable and devastating. The trail of iron left behind not just dead bodies and burned villages, but something far more insidious: disease. The pigs that De Soto brought, the very creatures meant to sustain his army, carried European pathogens. The constant movement of his large force from one chiefdom to another spread smallpox, measles, and other diseases like wildfire. These epidemics, sweeping through populations that had no immunity, caused a demographic catastrophe. The powerful chiefdoms of the Mississippian culture, which had flourished for centuries, collapsed in the decades following De Soto's passage. Their towns were abandoned, their social structures fragmented, and their populations decimated. When later European explorers arrived in the southeast, they found a vastly different landscape than what De Soto had described, a land less densely populated with smaller, more fragmented tribes. The memory of De Soto's brutal passage and the silent killer he unleashed would forever shape the future of the American Southeast, a legacy of suffering etched into the very soil of the continent. The Gilded Mirage, Coronado's quest for the 7 cities of gold. While Hernando de Soto was hacking his way through the humid swamps of the southeast, another, even grander expedition was being born. The Spanish crown, not content to gamble on just one man, was about to launch a second simultaneous invasion into the unknown heart of North America. Both were chasing the same phantom, another Peru, another golden empire. The spark, as it so often was, came from the words of a survivor. When Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and his 3 companions emerged from the wilderness in 1536, they were a miracle. Their story was one of unimaginable suffering. But in the ambitious court of Mexico City, their tale of horror was read as a treasure map. The Viceroy of New Spain, Antonio de Mendoza, was a man consumed by ambition. He was a rival to the great Hernán Cortés, and he desperately needed a conquest of his own to secure his name in history. Cabeza de Vaca had been careful in his report, speaking only of rumors. But one of his companions was not. His name was Estebanico, the Moroccan, the enslaved man, the first African to explore North America. He had walked the continent with Cabeza de Vaca, and his stories were far more colorful. He spoke of rumors he had heard in the deep interior, of great cities to the north, places with houses, 4 and 5 stories high, where the people used turquoise to decorate their doors. This was all Mendoza needed. He organized a small reconnaissance mission in 1539. To lead it, he chose a friar, Fray Marcos de Niza, to give the expedition a holy purpose. But as his guide, he sent the one man who could navigate this unknown world, Estebanico. The 2 men were a study in contrasts. Fray Marcos, the cautious clergyman, and Estebanico, who, after his 8-year odyssey, had become a powerful figure in his own right. As they traveled north, Estebanico would go ahead, dressed in robes adorned with feathers and bells and acting as a shaman. He was no longer a slave. He was a godlike figure, a child of the sun. He sent back reports to Fray Marcos promising greater and greater wonders. Finally, he reached the land of the Zuni people, in what is now New Mexico. He arrived at the pueblo of Hawiku, demanding women and turquoise. But the Zuni were not impressed. They were a proud, independent people. To them, this strange black man making demands was a threat, not a god. They killed him. Fray Marcos, following behind, heard the news of Estebanico's death and fled in terror. He never set foot in the pueblo. He never got close. But what he told the Viceroy when he returned to Mexico City would change the course of history. He claimed he had seen it from a distance, a city shimmering on a hilltop at sunset. He called it Cibola. He swore it was larger and finer than Mexico City itself, the very capital of the Aztecs. He claimed he saw the natives using gold and silver in great abundance. It was a lie. A pious fraud, perhaps, told by a terrified man to save face. Or perhaps it was a true self-delusion, a mirage seen in the desert sun. Whatever the reason, it was the lie that launched 1,000 men. The gilded mirage was born. Viceroy Mendoza, electrified, spared no expense. This was to be the greatest, most spectacular expedition the New World had ever seen. And to lead it, he chose a trusted political ally, a young nobleman named Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. In February 1540, the army assembled at Compostela, on the Pacific coast of Mexico. It was not a handful of ragged adventurers. It was a moving city, an invasion force of staggering proportions. 335 Spanish soldiers in gleaming armor, 300 native allies from central Mexico, 550 horses, thousands of pack animals, and a vast, walking herd of sheep and cattle for food. It was an investment of almost unimaginable wealth, funded by Coronado, Mendoza, and other private investors. They were all quite literally banking on Cibola's gold. The journey began as a parade, but as they marched north into the harsh, uncharted deserts of Arizona, the parade became a death march. The land was an inferno. Men and horses died of thirst. The heavy armor became a curse. The vast herds of livestock slowed them to a crawl. They were starving, reduced to eating roots and wild plants. Impatient and desperate, Coronado took a small flying vanguard of 100 men and pushed ahead, racing toward their golden prize. In July 1540, after months of hardship, they finally arrived. They stood on the last ridge, looked down, and saw it. Cibola. The moment must have been one of the most profound disappointments in human history. There was no city larger than Mexico. There was no gold. There were no shining walls. Below them was Hawiku, a modest multi-story pueblo built not of gold but of mud and stone. It was a little crowded village, as one of the soldiers would later write, all crumpled up together. The Zuni people, seeing the armed alien force, prepared to defend their homes. The Spanish, enraged by the lies of the Zuni and desperate for the food inside, attacked. The Battle of Hawiku was a short, brutal, one-sided affair. Coronado himself was knocked unconscious by a rock dropped from the walls. But the Spanish steel was too much. They took the pueblo, and inside they found what they were truly after: corn, beans, and water. They found no gold. Not a single ounce. The fury of the soldiers turned on Fray Marcos de Niza, the man who had told the lie. He was cursed, called a liar and a scoundrel. Coronado, his reputation and fortune on the line, quietly sent the friar back to Mexico in disgrace. Coronado was now in an impossible position. He could not return empty-handed. He had failed, but he could not admit it. So he set up his headquarters at the pueblo, and for the next 2 years began to systematically, desperately search for the gold that had to be there. He sent his captains out in every direction. One group, led by Garcia Lopez de Cardenas, marched west, searching for a rumored great river. They found it, but what they saw left them speechless. They stood on the rim of a colossal, mile-deep abyss, a great canyon that seemed to sink into the very sky. They were the first Europeans to see the Grand Canyon. They tried to climb down to the river, but after a full day they gave up, defeated by the sheer, impossible scale of the land. It was a perfect metaphor for the expedition, a land of vast, terrifying wonders, but no wealth. Another captain, Hernando de Alvarado, was sent east. He found the fertile Rio Grande Valley, home to the Tiguex Pueblos near modern-day Bernalillo, New Mexico. Here in a camp they found a native man, a Pawnee slave who would change the course of the expedition. The Spanish called him El Turco, the Turk, because they thought he looked Turkish. The Turk was a masterful storyteller. Seeing what the Spanish wanted, he told them a new, more fantastic story. Cibola, he said, was nothing. But far to the east, across the Great Plains, was his homeland, a land called Quivira. In Quivira, he said, the lord of the land ate from plates of solid gold. The common people used silver. The river, he claimed, was 6 miles wide and filled with fish as large as horses. The king, he whispered, was lulled to sleep by the sound of golden bells. Hanging from the branches of a tree, it was the second gilded mirage. Coronado, desperate to believe, moved his entire army to the Tiguex Pueblos for the winter of 1540 to 41. That winter was one of unimaginable brutality. The Spanish army, now quartered among the Tiguex people, demanded all their food, all their blankets, and even their homes. When the Pueblos resisted, Coronado responded with total war. In what became known as the Tiguex War, the Spanish burned villages, laid siege to pueblos, and massacred hundreds of people. They had come as explorers. They had become brutal conquerors, laying waste to a land that had no gold to give. In the spring of 1541, with the Turk as his guide, Coronado marched his entire army out onto the Great Plains. They were marching for Quivira. They entered a landscape that no European had ever comprehended. A flat, featureless sea of grass that stretched to every horizon. The Llano Estacado or staked plains. The land was so empty they had to leave stakes to find their way back. They found humpbacked cows, the American bison, in herds so vast they blackened the plains. But they found no gold. They wandered for weeks completely lost. It became clear the Turk was lying. Enraged, Coronado made one last desperate gamble. He sent his main army, the sick and the disillusioned, back to Tigex. He took 30 of his best horsemen and rode north with the Turk in chains for 40 days. He rode deep into the heart of the continent into modern-day Kansas. In August 1541, he found it, Quivira. It was yet another final soul-crushing disappointment. There was no gold. There were no great cities. Quivira was a collection of mud and grass huts home to the Wichita people. They were poor hunters and farmers. Their great king was a chief, wearing not a crown of gold but a simple copper ornament around his neck. The mirage had evaporated. Coronado confronted the Turk, who finally confessed. He had been put up to it by the Tigex people. His mission was to lead the Spanish out onto the plains, get them lost, and let them starve to death. A brilliant, desperate act of resistance. Coronado gave the order. His men wrapped a rope around the Turk's neck and strangled him. The quest for the 7 cities of gold was over. A broken and bankrupt Coronado returned to Tiguex, where he spent another miserable winter. In 1542, he gave the order to retreat. The grand army that had marched north with such fanfare straggled back to Mexico City in tatters. Of the 300 native allies and 335 Spanish, only about 100 made it back. Coronado's return was a disgrace. He was stripped of his titles and lived out his life in obscurity. His reputation and fortune shattered. The expedition was a total failure. It found no gold, it established no colonies, and it bankrupted everyone involved. But in its failure, it had achieved something monumental. It had revealed the true nature of North America. It was not a land of quick riches and golden empires. It was a continent of vast geographic wonders, of immense deserts, bottomless canyons, and endless plains. The gilded mirage had cost thousands of lives, ruined ancient cultures, and broken one of the largest expeditions in history. And in doing so, it had finally and definitively killed the Spanish dream of finding another Peru in the north. The Florida fortress St. Augustine, America's oldest city for half a century, La Florida had been a graveyard. It was a land cursed by Spanish blood and haunted by failure. The ghosts of Ponce de León, Pánfilo de Narváez, and Hernando de Soto served as a grim testament to its nature. It was a land that devoured armies, a land that had swallowed fortunes and shattered dreams. The grand quests for golden cities, Cibola, Appalachian, Quivira had all ended in the same dusty, inglorious silence. By the 1560s, Spain had all but given up on the vast territory it claimed. La Florida was a line on a map, a possessory claim that was too vast, too hostile, and too expensive to enforce. The Spanish crown, its coffers now overflowing from the silver mines of Mexico and Peru, was focused on protecting its wealth, not wasting it on fruitless expeditions into the northern wilderness. The real treasure wasn't in Florida. It was sailing past it. The vital artery of the Spanish Empire was the Gulf Stream. This powerful ocean current, a high-speed river within the sea, flowed up the coast of Florida before turning east, providing the fastest, most reliable route for Spain's treasure fleets to return to Europe. These fleets, laden with the silver of Potosi and the gold of the Aztecs, were the lifeblood of the empire, and Spain's enemies knew it. By the mid-16th century, a new power was rising: France. A bitter rival to Spanish supremacy, France was also torn apart by its own internal conflicts. The brutal wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants, known as Huguenots. For the Huguenots, led by the influential Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the New World offered a dual promise: a refuge from Catholic persecution at home, and a strategic base from which to wage war on their great Catholic enemy, Spain. And there was no more perfect place to strike at Spain than the Florida coast, right alongside the highway of its treasure fleets. In 1564, a French expedition led by René Goulin de Laudonnière and financed by Coligny landed on the Atlantic coast of Florida. They sailed up a wide, deep river, a river the natives called the Wellica, known today as the St. Johns River. There, near modern-day Jacksonville, they built a substantial triangular fort, complete with a moat, cannons, and a small settlement. They named it Fort Caroline. When word of this reached King Philip II of Spain in Madrid, it was received not as a mere trespass, but as an act of war. This was an existential threat. The French, and worse Protestant French, had planted a dagger pointed at the heart of the Spanish Indies. They were heretics squatting on Spanish-claimed land, perfectly positioned to intercept and plunder the treasure fleets. This was not a job for a gold-seeking explorer. This was a job for an executioner. King Philip II turned to the most capable and most ruthless naval commander in his service, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés. Menéndez was not a dreamer. He was a hardened admiral, a brilliant strategist, and a Catholic fanatic who had dedicated his life to serving his king and his God. He despised Protestantism, viewing it as a cancer to be violently excised. He also had a personal, tragic connection to Florida. His son Juan had been shipwrecked on its coast years earlier, and Menéndez was obsessed with finding him. Philip II gave Menéndez a blunt, ironclad commission. He was to sail to Florida, expel the French heretics and corsairs by any means necessary, and then establish a permanent fortified Spanish presence to secure the coast for good. In July 1565, Menéndez set sail from Spain with a powerful fleet. This was a mission of war and colonization. As he neared the Florida coast, he was caught in the same fierce hurricane season that would define the entire campaign. On August 28, the feast day of St. Augustine of Hippo, his ships found a safe harbor, a deep inlet protected by sandy dunes. He noted its strategic value. He sailed north, finding the French fleet anchored off the mouth of the St. Johns River, where they were reinforcing Fort Caroline under their newly arrived commander, Jean Ribault. Menéndez's ships were smaller. A naval battle was impossible. The French taunted the Spanish, calling them Catholic dogs. Menéndez, pragmatic, turned his ship south. He returned to the harbor he had spotted days earlier. On September 8, 1565, Menéndez rowed ashore. In a ceremony of high imperial and religious theater, he planted the royal standard of Spain, kissed the cross, and proclaimed the land for his king. He named the new settlement St. Augustine. This moment was a profound shift in American history. St. Augustine was not a camp of exploration. It was not a temporary trading post. It was a presidio, a military fortress, a permanent stake in the ground. Its founding marks the establishment of the first continuous permanent European settlement in the future United States. It was founded not for gold but for strategy, out of geopolitical necessity and religious fury. The French at Fort Caroline, now led by the aggressive Ribault, saw Menéndez's new settlement as a direct threat. Ribault made a bold decision. He would take his best ships and soldiers, sail south, and wipe St. Augustine off the map with a decisive seaborne assault. This was the moment Menéndez, the master strategist had been waiting for. As Ribot's fleet sailed south, they were caught by the full apocalyptic fury of a hurricane. The storm, which had been brewing for days, smashed the French fleet, driving every single ship onto the beaches and shoals miles south of St. Augustine, wrecking them completely. Menendez, his own ship safely in harbor, watched the storm. He knew, with a soldier's instinct, that the French fleet would be scattered. He also knew that Fort Caroline, 50 miles to the north, was now undefended, its best soldiers all on Ribot's ships. He made an audacious gamble. He would not wait for the French to attack. He would attack them. While the hurricane was still raging, Menendez gathered 500 of his best men. In the teeth of the blinding rain and wind, he marched them overland through the swamps, palmetto thickets, and flooded creeks. It was a brutal 4-day march. At dawn on September 20th, Menendez's exhausted, mud-soaked men burst from the woods and fell upon Fort Caroline. The garrison was completely unprepared. They were asleep, their defenses lax, believing no one could move in such a storm. The Spanish attack was a slaughter. They overwhelmed the fort in minutes, killing the men but sparing the women and children. By the time the sun was up, the French flag was down, and the Spanish standard was flying over the captured fort, which Menendez renamed San Mateo. He had secured the north. Now he turned his attention to the south. Returning to St. Augustine, Menendez received news from local natives. A large group of white men, shipwrecked and unarmed, was stranded on a beach a few miles south. Menendez marched to an inlet. On the other side were the first 200 survivors of Ribot's wrecked fleet. They were starving, soaked, and had no weapons. They pleaded for passage to Fort Caroline, not knowing it had already fallen. Menendez, his face a mask of iron, gave them his terms. He was a Catholic. They were Huguenots. He was serving his king. They were trespassing. He demanded unconditional surrender. The desperate French, with no other options, were ferried across the inlet 10 at a time. As each group reached Menendez's side, their hands were bound behind their backs. They were marched over a dune and, out of sight of the men still on the other side, were systematically executed by sword and pike. A few days later, the second group of survivors, including Jean Ribot himself, was found at the same inlet. The same grim ritual was repeated. Ribot and his men surrendered. They were bound and they were killed. Menendez spared only a few who claimed to be Catholic, and a handful of musicians. Over 250 men were executed. The inlet would forever after be known by the name Menendez gave it, Matanzas, the inlet of the slaughters. With this brutal final act, the French threat in Florida was extinguished. St. Augustine was secure. Menendez had, in a single, brilliant and ruthless campaign, defended his new colony, captured the enemy's fort, and annihilated their army. St. Augustine, America's oldest city, was born in blood. It was a fortress on the edge of an empire, a strategic anchor against all rivals, and a testament to the new, permanent phase of European colonization. The age of chasing gilded mirages was over. The age of digging in, of building walls, and of fighting for every scrap of this contested continent had begun. The Lost Colony, England's mysterious failure at Roanoke. The 16th century story of North America was, thus far, a story written in Spanish. It was a tale of brutal conquest, of vast failed marches, and finally of a single, blood-soaked fortress, St. Augustine, Spain, having failed to find its golden mirages in the north, had settled for a strategic ironclad claim. They had built a fortress to protect what they truly valued, the treasure fleet sailing from the south. But Spain was not the only power in Europe. And the New World was not the only sea. A new player was watching from the north, a Protestant island nation, England. led by a queen, Elizabeth I, who was as cunning and ambitious as her great rival, King Philip II of Spain. For Elizabeth, the New World was not a place to colonize. It was a place to profit. It was a vast, ungoverned stage for her sea dogs, men like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, to conduct a shadow war of state-sanctioned piracy, to singe the King of Spain's beard by plundering the very treasure fleet St. Augustine was built to protect. But for that, they needed a base. A hidden harbor, a privateer's nest on the American coast, a place to repair ships and plan raids, safely out of reach of Spanish patrols. This was the dream of Sir Walter Raleigh. A favorite of the Queen, Raleigh was a visionary, a poet, and a relentless promoter. In 1584, he was granted a royal charter to discover, search, find out, and view any lands not already possessed by a Christian prince. He immediately dispatched a small reconnaissance mission led by Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow. They landed on the coast of what is now North Carolina. Unlike the Spanish, who had met only swamps and hostile warriors, Amadas and Barlow found a paradise. They described the land as a new Eden, the air most sweet, comfortable, and wholesome, the natives most gentle, loving, and faithful. They brought two willing representatives back to England, Manteo and Wanchese, who became sensations at the Elizabethan court. Raleigh, a master of public relations, named this new land Virginia in honor of his patron, the Virgin Queen. The report was a triumph. But it was, like so many stories of the New World, a work of fiction. In 1585, Raleigh, with the Queen's blessing, sent his first real colony. It was not a group of families. It was a military occupation. 107 men, led by the rigid soldier Ralph Lane and transported by the volatile Sir Richard Grenville. It included the brilliant scientist Thomas Harriot, and most importantly the artist John White, whose watercolors would give Europe its first true glimpse of this new land. They built a small fort on Roanoke Island, a patch of land sheltered behind the barrier islands of the Outer Banks. And almost immediately, the paradise turned sour. These were soldiers, not farmers. They had no intention of feeding themselves. They expected, like the conquistadors before them, to be fed by the local people. The gentle, loving natives of the Secatan and Roanoke tribes, led by their chief Wingina, quickly grew tired of these demanding, arrogant, and heavily armed guests. The relationship shattered over a single symbolic incident, a missing silver cup. Believing the natives had stolen it, Governor Ralph Lane authorized a reprisal. He and his men burnt and spoiled their corn and town, and in a later skirmish, Lane himself killed Chief Wingina, beheading him. In one brutal act, the English had repeated the fatal error of the Spanish. They had turned potential allies into mortal enemies. The colony, now surrounded by a hostile population, began to starve. 1 year later, in 1586, an English fleet appeared on the horizon. It was not Raleigh's relief mission. It was Sir Francis Drake, fresh from sacking and burning the Spanish cities of St. Augustine and Cartagena. He found Lane's men starving, desperate, and ready to quit. He rescued them, taking the entire colony back to England. When Raleigh's actual relief ship arrived just weeks later, it found the fort at Roanoke deserted. The first English colony in America had lasted less than a year. It was a total, humiliating failure, but Raleigh was not finished. He had learned a crucial lesson. A military outpost could not survive. What he needed was a real, self-sustaining plantation, a colony of families of men, women, and children who would have a stake in the land. In 1587, he funded a second, larger attempt. He appointed John White, the artist, the man who had seen the land and its people with a more sympathetic eye, as the new governor. This time 117 colonists set sail. They were not soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, and for the first time 17 women and 9 children. Their plan was not to return to the poisoned well of Roanoke. Their charter was for the city of Raleigh, to be established on the deep, promising waters of the Chesapeake Bay, far to the north. But from the moment they left England, the mission was troubled. The expedition's pilot, a man named Simon Fernandez, was a man in a hurry. When they reached the Outer Banks, Fernandez, against all protests, refused to sail any further. He claimed the summer was too far gone. He forced John White and his 117 men, women, and children ashore at the one place they did not want to be, the old abandoned and hostile fort on Roanoke Island. They were stranded in the ruins of the first failure. They tried to make the best of it. They rebuilt the crumbling huts and re-established contact with Monteo, their longtime ally. But the other local tribes, still remembering Ralph Lane's butchery, were unforgiving. Just days into their new life, a colonist named George Howe was found in the woods, his body pierced by 16 arrows. The colony was surrounded. It was low on supplies, and it was in the wrong place. Despite this, a single ray of hope appeared. On August 18, 1587, John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to a baby girl. She was named Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. But a baby could not save them. The colonists, fearing a long, violent winter, knew they needed help. They needed to tell Raleigh where they were, and they needed more food, more gunpowder, more everything. They elected their governor, John White, to return to England. White refused. He did not want to go. He had, as he wrote, bade himself to the mission. He was terrified of being seen as a coward, abandoning his people. And he could not bear to leave his daughter, Eleanor, and his new granddaughter, Virginia. But the colonists were insistent. He was the only one who could navigate the political waters in London. In late August 1587, a reluctant John White sailed for England, promising to return with a relief fleet by the spring. When he arrived in London, he was met with catastrophic news. England was not thinking of a tiny, distant colony. It was preparing for an invasion. Philip II of Spain, furious at Drake's raids and English support for Protestant rebels, had unleashed the invincible armada. Every available ship, every sailor, every barrel of powder was impounded by Queen Elizabeth I for the defense of the realm. John White was trapped. His colony's fate, 3,000 miles away, was sealed by a global superpower conflict. For 3 agonizing years, he lobbied, he begged, he pleaded. The Armada was defeated in 1588, but the war continued and ships remained scarce. Finally, in 1590, he managed to buy passage on a privateering vessel, a ship more interested in hunting Spanish treasure than in rescuing a lost colony. On August 18, 1590, his granddaughter, Virginia's 3rd birthday, John White finally returned to Roanoke Island. The landing was ominous. It was dusk. As they approached the shore, they saw a great smoke rising from the trees. They fired their cannons and played English folk songs on their trumpets, a signal to any Christian ear. There was no answer, only silence. The next morning, White and his men went ashore. They found the settlement empty. The houses were gone. The fort was gone. But it was not a scene of destruction. It had not been burned. There were no bodies, no signs of a great battle. It was as if the colony had been dismantled. The entire settlement, all 117 people, had vanished. Then they saw the clues. Carved into a tree near the entrance, they found 3 letters. CRO. White knew what it meant. He searched further, finding the main palisade post. There, in fair capital letters, was carved the single cryptic word, Croatoan. This was not a message of despair. It was a message of intent. Before he left, White had prearranged a distress signal with the colonists. If they were forced to leave Roanoke in a hurry, they were to carve a Maltese cross above their message. John White looked at the carving on the post. There was no cross. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island just south of Roanoke. It was the home of Manteo, their one constant friend. The carving meant the colonists had not been slaughtered. They had left willingly and calmly to live with the Croatoan people. White was overjoyed. His family was alive. He returned to his ship, ordering the captain to sail for Croatoan at once. But the New World had one last cruel trick to play. A mighty storm, a classic late-summer hurricane, swept down on the fleet. The ship's anchors tore loose and the crews nearly mutinied, terrified of being wrecked on the treacherous Outer Banks. The captain, his privateering voyage in jeopardy, refused to risk his ship or his men. He declared he was sailing for the West Indies. John White, his heart broken, was overruled. He was forced to sail away from Roanoke, away from Croatoan, away from his daughter and his granddaughter. He would never return. He died years later, never knowing what had become of the 1 to 17 people who had trusted him. The lost colony of Roanoke passed into legend, becoming America's oldest, most haunting mystery. Had they truly peacefully assimilated with the Croatoan? Were they later wiped out by disease or a rival tribe? Or were they found and killed by the Spanish, who were known to be patrolling the area? We will never know. But the failure at Roanoke, England's first ghostly footprint on the continent, was not an end. It was a lesson. It taught the English that the New World was not an Eden. It was a place that would demand blood, sacrifice, and a new, more desperate kind of resolve. The dream of a golden privateer's base was dead. The new dream would be one of simple, brutal survival, starving for gold, the desperate beginnings of Jamestown 20 years. For 2 decades, the name Roanoke had been a ghost story whispered in the halls of London, a cryptic warning carved on a tree. Sir Walter Raleigh's lost colony was England's great humiliating failure, a testament to a new world that seemed to swallow ambition whole. But by 1606, England had a new king, James the Friar, and with him a new, colder ambition. The swashbuckling, privateering days of Queen Elizabeth were over. The long war with Spain had ended. The future was not in stealing Spanish gold. It was in finding English gold. The model was clear. Spain had found in Mexico and Peru unimaginable wealth. Surely the vast uncharted territory of North America, Virginia as they called it all, held a similar prize. This time the venture would not be led by a single visionary knight. It would be a business. In 1606, King James chartered the Virginia Company, a joint stock corporation. Its goals were not spiritual. They were not about religious freedom. The goal written into its very charter was profit. Investors in London poured money into the company, and they expected a return. They expected gold, silver, or at the very least, a river passage to the riches of Asia. In December 1606, 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, slipped out of the Thames River. On board were 104 men and boys. This was the first and perhaps most fatal error. They were not the right men. They were not farmers, not builders, not families. They were, in large part, gentlemen, the second and third sons of English aristocracy, men who had no inheritance at home and considered manual labor beneath their station. They were soldiers, refiners, goldsmiths, and adventurers. They were men coming to a wilderness with the expectation of finding a treasure chest, not building a society. After a grueling 4-month voyage, They entered the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay in April 1607. They had been instructed to find a location that was secure from the Spanish, who considered them illegal trespassers. They sailed 60 miles up a wide, powerful river, which they named the James in honor of their king. On May 14, 1607, they chose their spot. It was a small marshy peninsula, later an island. From a military perspective, it seemed perfect. The deep water allowed their ships to anchor right offshore. It was attached to the mainland by only a thin neck of land, making it easy to defend, and it was hidden from any Spanish patrols sailing the coast. From a human perspective, it was a death trap. The land was a low, tidal swamp. The air was thick with clouds of mosquitoes. The river itself was a slow-moving, brackish bog. In the summer, it was a breeding ground for malaria and typhoid. The drinking water was a briny, contaminated poison, and they were not alone. They had just planted their flag in the heart of one of the most powerful and sophisticated native empires on the East Coast, the Powhatan Confederacy. Ruled by the paramount chief, Wahunsanakaw, or Chief Powhatan, this empire of 30-some tribes and 14,000 people watched these strange, bearded men with deep suspicion. The colonists, oblivious to their peril, immediately began to follow their investors' orders. They built a crude triangular fort, but they spent far more of their energy on the one thing that mattered to them: gold. This is the central irony of Jamestown. They were from the very beginning starving for gold, and because they were starving for gold, they soon began to starve for food. Instead of planting corn, they dug in the dirt for shiny minerals. They found vast quantities of fool's gold pyrite, which they joyfully shoveled into the holds of their ships, believing they had struck it rich. They wasted precious time, precious energy, and precious daylight, all while their food supplies dwindled. The gentlemen refused to work. The soldiers and adventurers only knew how to fight. Then the summer sickness arrived. The combination of malaria, dysentery from the foul water, and malnutrition tore through the fort. Men died so quickly they could barely be buried. By September 1607, just 4 months after they landed, only 38 of the original 104 colonists were still alive. Jamestown was not a colony. It was a charnel house. Into this chaos stepped Captain John Smith. Smith was not a gentleman. He was a commoner, a brash, abrasive, and pragmatic soldier of fortune who had fought all over Europe. He was despised by the colony's aristocratic leaders, but he was the only one who understood the reality of their situation. He seized control of the failing colony and imposed a simple, brutal law: he that will not work shall not eat. He forced the gentlemen to cut wood, to build shelter, and most importantly, to stop digging for imaginary gold. He turned his attention to the only other source of food: the Powhatan. Smith, a relentless realist, began a campaign of forced trade, sometimes bartering, often threatening to get corn from the native villages. It was on one of these missions, in December 1607, that Smith was captured by Powhatan's warriors. According to Smith's own account, written years later and possibly embellished, he was dragged before the great chief. His head was forced onto a stone, and warriors raised their clubs to execute him. At the last second, Powhatan's young daughter, Pocahontas, whose real name was Matawaka, rushed forward and laid her own head upon his, saving his life. Historians today believe this was likely not a spontaneous rescue, but a complex pre-planned ritual, a symbolic execution and rebirth to adopt Smith, and by extension the English, as a subordinate tribe within Powhatan's empire. But whatever its meaning, it worked. A fragile truce was established. Pocahontas, a curious girl of perhaps 11 or 12, became an envoy. visiting the fort and bringing vital supplies of corn that kept the few remaining English alive through that first desperate winter. But the peace was temporary. In the fall of 1609, a mysterious gunpowder explosion severely injured Smith, forcing him to sail back to England. With his iron-fisted leadership gone, Jamestown collapsed into anarchy. And it was then that the true nightmare began. Chief Powhatan, now convinced the English were a parasitic threat, decided to wipe them out. He cut off all trade. He laid siege to the fort. As the winter of 1609-1610 set in, the English were trapped inside their walls with no food. This period became known as the starving time. The 500 colonists inside the fort ate their horses. They ate their dogs and cats. They ate the rats, mice, and snakes they could catch. When that was gone, they boiled their own leather shoes and belts to make a leather stew. The hunger drove them mad. Some tried to flee, only to be killed by Powhatan's warriors. Those who remained descended into the ultimate taboo. They began to dig up the graves of their own dead to eat the corpses. Archaeological evidence has confirmed this grim reality, with the discovery of a 14-year-old girl's skull, Jane, marked with the clear, hesitant cuts of cannibalism. By the spring of 1610, of the 500 people who had begun the winter, only 60 remained. They were skeletal, broken, and half insane. In May 1610, the survivors gave up. They had been starving for gold, and all they had found was death. They abandoned Fort James, boarded their small ships, and began to sail down the James River, intending to abandon America forever. The English Empire in the New World was hours from dissolving. And then, at the mouth of the river, they saw an impossible sight. A fleet of English ships sailing in. It was Lord de la Warr, arriving with 150 new colonists and a year's worth of supplies. He ordered the survivors to turn around. By a miracle of timing, Jamestown was saved from extinction, but it was still not profitable. Under de la Warr and his deputy, Sir Thomas Dale, the colony was run as a brutal military dictatorship. Men were executed for stealing an ear of corn. But the Virginia Company in London was going bankrupt. After years of death, misery, and failure, they had no gold, no silver, and no passage to Asia. The colony's salvation came not from a mineral, but from a plant. In 1612, a colonist named John Rolfe, who would later forge a new peace by marrying Pocahontas, began experimenting. He smuggled in a new sweet strain of tobacco seeds from the Spanish Caribbean. The native Virginia tobacco was harsh, but this new hybrid thrived in the Virginia soil. The first shipment sent to London was a sensation. The European market was instantly addicted. This brown gold was more valuable pound for pound than many precious metals. Finally, Jamestown had found its profit. The starving was over. The colony, founded on a gilded fantasy, was saved by a different kind of gold. This new, insatiable demand for tobacco would secure Jamestown's future as the first permanent English settlement in America. But it also unleashed a new, voracious hunger. A hunger for the land to grow it and for the labor to work it. A hunger that would come to define America for the next 250 years. The Pilgrims packed, a new society on Plymouth Rock, while Jamestown was clawing its way back from starvation, its future secured by the addictive brown gold of tobacco. Another, very different English ship was battling the icy gales of the North Atlantic. This ship was not searching for a mineral, a passage to Asia, or a quick profit for a corporation. It was searching for something far more radical, something intangible, and in the 17th century, something far more dangerous: freedom. The ship was the Mayflower. Its passengers were not adventurers. They were not soldiers. They were in their own minds exiles. We call them the Pilgrims. They were a small devout congregation of religious radicals known as separatists. Their crime? They believed the Church of England, the state church, was hopelessly corrupt. A popish imitation of the Catholic Church it had replaced. They refused to bow to its bishops, read from its prayer book, or recognize its authority. Their goal was to separate and form their own pure church, based only on the literal word of the Bible. For this belief, they were hunted. In England, they were spied on, fined, arrested, and their leaders were executed. To escape persecution, they first fled to Leiden in the Netherlands, a place famous for its religious tolerance. But after a decade, they found themselves in a new kind of prison. They were poor. Their children were growing up Dutch, forgetting their English language and culture. They were, as their leader William Bradford would write, on the verge of being scattered or swallowed up. They feared they were losing their identity. And so, they looked to the one place on earth vast enough to build their New Jerusalem, a society modeled on their interpretation of the Word of God, America. They struck a deal with the Virginia Company, the same corporation that funded Jamestown. They would be planters working for the company, in exchange for passage and the right to establish a settlement near the mouth of the Hudson River, at the northern edge of the Virginia colony. But the Mayflower that sailed from Plymouth, England, in September 1620 was a divided vessel. Of the 102 passengers, only about half were from the Leiden congregation, the Saints as they called themselves. The other half were strangers, carpenters, coopers, soldiers, and servants recruited by the company to do the hard labor. These strangers were not motivated by God. They were motivated by economics. The voyage was a 66-day nightmare. They were battered by relentless autumn gales. The ship's main beam cracked and they were blown hundreds of miles off course. In early November, they sighted land. But it was not the Hudson River. It was the hooked, sandy arm of Cape Cod in what is now Massachusetts. This was not Virginia. This was New England, a territory for which they had no patent, no charter, and no legal right to settle. A crisis erupted. They were floating in a legal void, anchored in a cold, unknown harbor, and the strangers on board, realizing the situation, began to make discontented and mutinous speeches. Their argument was simple and terrifying. Since they were not in Virginia, the Virginia Company's patent was void. Therefore, the Pilgrims' authority over them was also void. When they landed, the strangers declared none had power to command them. The entire venture was about to collapse into anarchy before a single foot touched the shore. The separatists, men like John Carver and William Bradford, realized that their religious covenant was not enough to hold a civil society together. They needed something more. They needed a government. So in the cramped, cold cabin of the Mayflower, these 41 men gathered to do something revolutionary. They did not wait for a king, a company, or a governor to tell them what to do. They decided to create a government right there, out of thin air and common consent. The document they drafted and signed on November 11, 1620, is one of the most important in American history. We call it the Mayflower Compact. It is not a constitution. It is barely 200 words long. It is at its heart a covenant, a sacred promise, just like the one they had made with their God. In it, the signatories, both saints and strangers, agreed to covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. This was the Pilgrims' Pact. It was a radical act of self-government. It established a government that derived its power not from a crown, but from the consent of the governed. It was a social contract, a desperate, practical solution to the problem of survival, planting the first, tiny seed of democracy in the rocky soil of New England. With this pact signed, they sent scouting parties ashore. After weeks of exploring the icy, desolate coast, they found a suitable harbor. It was the site of a recently abandoned Native American village, Patuxet, which had been cleared by a terrible plague. They found freshwater springs and a high hill, perfect for defense. On December 21st, 1620, they began to build their settlement. They called it Plymouth. The starving time that had nearly destroyed Jamestown now came for them. That first winter was a trial of almost biblical proportions. They were unprepared, their supplies were meager, and the New England cold was a brutal, relentless enemy. Of the 102 people who had arrived on the Mayflower, 51 would be dead before the spring. That is 1 out of every 2. At the peak of the Great Sickness, only 6 or 7 people, including Bradford and the colony's military captain, Miles Standish, were healthy enough to tend to the sick, feed the living, and bury the dead. They buried them at night on Coles Hill in unmarked graves to hide their dwindling, pathetic numbers from any native eyes that might be watching from the forest. Jamestown was founded on a fantasy of gold. Plymouth was founded on a bedrock of faith, and it was being tested by an apocalypse of cold and disease. When spring finally came in March 1621, the few survivors, gaunt and grieving, were startled by an impossible sight. A tall Native American man walked out of the woods, strode boldly into their half-built settlement and, in a clear voice, said, "Welcome, Englishmen." His name was Samoset. He was an Abenaki Sachem from what is now Maine, and he had learned broken English from fishermen. A few days later he returned with another man, the man who would save them all, Tisquantum, known as Squanto. Squanto's life story was a tragedy that, by a miracle, became the Pilgrim's salvation. He was the last surviving member of the Patuxet, the very tribe whose land the Pilgrims were now occupying. He had been kidnapped by an English captain years earlier, sold into slavery in Spain, escaped to London, learned to speak perfect English, and had finally managed to return home just 1 year before the Pilgrims arrived, only to find his entire village, every man, woman, and child, wiped out by the plague. He was a man with no people, living in a world he no longer recognized. And now, in this village of ghosts, had appeared these strange, pale people from the very country that had stolen his life. In an act of incredible grace, or perhaps profound loneliness, Squanto chose to help them. He became their interpreter, their guide, and their teacher. He taught them, as Bradford wrote, how to set their corn, where to take fish, and to procure other commodities. He showed them the native way, to plant corn kernels with herring or shad in the small hills, a perfect fertilizer for the sandy soil. Squanto also brokered the most important alliance of their lives. He arranged a meeting between the Pilgrims' governor, John Carver, and Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag, the dominant tribe in the region. The Wampanoag, too, had been weakened by the plague and were threatened by their rivals, the Narragansett. They saw these strange newcomers with their powerful guns as potential allies. In March 1621, the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag signed a treaty of mutual defense. It was a pact of survival that would, almost miraculously, be honored for over 50 years. In the autumn of 1621, after their first successful corn harvest, a harvest made possible only by Squanto's teaching and the Wampanoag's peace, the 50-odd survivors decided to hold a feast. Governor Bradford sent 4 men to hunt fowl. Massasoit, Hearing the celebratory gunfire, arrived with 90 of his warriors, perhaps fearing the treaty was broken. Seeing it was a celebration, the Wampanoag joined. They stayed for 3 days, contributing 5 deer to the feast. This event, this secular harvest festival, was not what the pilgrims would have called a Thanksgiving. That was a solemn day of prayer and fasting. But for us it has become the first Thanksgiving. It was a moment of profound, improbable peace. A celebration of shared survival between two vastly different cultures, standing on the ruins of a world destroyed by disease. Plymouth was not founded for profit but for an idea. It was a society born from a pact, a promise to govern themselves under just and equal laws. This idea, this simple act of self-creation in the cabin of a ship, would prove to be even more revolutionary than the tobacco plant, and far more enduring than the quest for gold. A continent transformed, the unsettling legacy of the first settlements, the year is 1621. Let us pause and look at the map of North America as a European would see it. For nearly 130 years since Columbus's first gamble, this vast green and terrifying continent had been a place of myth. It was a golden mirage, a great obstacle on the way to Asia, a graveyard for armies and a fortress of devils and savages. Now, after a century of failure, something has irrevocably changed. On the sandy, humid coast of La Florida, the bells of a Catholic mission toll in St. Augustine. It is a fortress, a presidio of Spanish soldiers and friars, a lonely, defiant outpost of a global, Catholic empire. 1,000 miles to the north, on the muddy banks of the James River in Jamestown, a different sound is heard. The haggling of merchants and the rhythmic thwack of axes clearing land. A fragile, fever-ridden commercial outpost, having survived its own cannibalistic hell, is now choking the landscape with a new, intoxicating, and immensely profitable crop, tobacco. And further north still, on the icy rim of Cape Cod Bay, the 50 starving, solemn survivors of the Mayflower gather their first meager harvest at Plymouth. They are a rogue religious cell, a tiny self-governing New Jerusalem, clutching a treaty with their Wampanoag neighbors as their only lifeline. St. Augustine, Jamestown, Plymouth. 3 tiny, desperate and improbable pinpricks of light on an overwhelmingly dark and massive continent. They are separated by 1,000 miles of wilderness, by language, by God, and by purpose. They are at this moment nothing more than a handful of survivors, clinging to the continent's edge. But they are the most important footholds in the modern world. They represent the end of the beginning. The age of exploration is over. The age of colonization has begun. The continent has been and will be forever transformed. The first and most profound transformation was the death of a fantasy. The first wave of Europeans, Ponce de León, Narvaez, de Soto, Coronado, were not colonists. They were conquistadors. They were plunderers hunting for a ghost. They were searching for another Peru, another golden Aztec empire. Coronado chased his gilded mirage across the empty plains of Kansas, only to find a village of grass huts. De Soto, in his trail of iron, tore a bloody scar across the southeast, finding not a single ounce of gold, and dying in the murky waters of the Mississippi. Their failure was the most important lesson of the 16th century. It taught the crowns of Europe that North America was not a treasure chest to be unlocked. It was a continent to be broken, tamed, and remade. The second and most terrible transformation was invisible. It was a biological apocalypse. The single greatest conqueror of the New World was not Hernando de Soto, nor Pedro Menendez, nor Captain John Smith. It was variola major, smallpox. It was measles, influenza, typhus. When De Soto's army marched through the southeast, his 600 soldiers were a walking biological weapon. His herd of pigs brought for food likely carried pathogens that leapt to the deer and then to the native populations. When the Spanish ships arrived, they brought more than men. They brought a microbial holocaust. The great Mississippian chiefdoms, the very kingdoms De Soto sought, collapsed in the decades after he passed. The world the Pilgrims found in 1620 was not a pristine wilderness. It was a post-apocalyptic one. The village of Patuxet, where they built Plymouth, was empty because its entire population had been wiped out by a plague, likely brought by English fishermen. Just a few years earlier, Squanto, their savior, was not a noble savage. He was the last traumatized survivor of a ghost town. Massasoit's Wampanoag made a treaty with the Pilgrims not out of friendship, but out of desperation, his own people having been reduced by 90%. This great dying emptied the land, shattering ancient societies, breaking lines of knowledge, and creating a vacuum that the new settlements would, by design or by accident, rush to fill. With this vacuum came the first permanent European models for a new society, and they were profoundly different. The Spanish model, born at St. Augustine, was the model of the fortress. It was top-down, royal, and absolute. It was a military garrison and a Catholic mission, a defensive spike driven into the sand to protect the real prize, the treasure fleet sailing from Mexico. Its purpose was to exclude rivals and convert the natives, often by force. It was a rigid, unyielding extension of the Spanish crown. The English model was the model of the plantation. It was bottom-up, corporate, and chaotic. Jamestown was not founded by a king, but by a company. It was a business venture that found its footing in a single addictive commodity. Tobacco, the brown gold, created an insatiable, explosive hunger for one thing: land. This hunger for land, an English concept of private ownership completely alien to native thought, set the stage for an unavoidable existential conflict. The fragile peace of Jamestown, and even the celebrated peace of Plymouth, could not last. They were not treaties of coexistence. They were temporary truces in a war for the continent itself. And this English model contained two other revolutionary and contradictory seeds. The first was the seed of self-government. When the Pilgrims signed the Mayflower Compact in that cold ship's cabin, they committed an act of radical improvisation. They created a government from the consent of the governed. A year earlier, in 1619, Jamestown had done something similar, convening the House of Burgesses, the first representative assembly in the New World. This idea that settlers, not distant kings, could make their own just and equal laws was an idea that, once planted, would grow into a revolution. The second seed, planted in that very same year, was its dark twin. In 1619, a year before the Mayflower arrived, a ship named the White Lion docked at Jamestown. It was a privateer that had stolen its cargo from a Spanish slaving vessel. That cargo was 20 and odd Africans who were sold to the colonists for food. This was the unsettling legacy. The same hunger for land created by tobacco created an unquenchable hunger for labor to work it. The arrival of these first Africans marks the beginning of the chattel slavery system that would define America, financing its dream of liberty with the reality of human bondage. So we are left with the continent, transformed. The gilded myths are dead, the native populations are decimated, and two European models, the Spanish fortress and the English plantation, are dug in. The stage is now set. The coming century will not be one of exploration. It will be one of violent imperial collision. The Spanish in the south, the English on the coast, and soon the French in the north, pushing down from Canada, all competing for the same vast, broken, and impossibly rich prize. The first settlements were not the end of the story. They were the lighting of a fuse, one that would burn for 150 years until it finally exploded in a war, not just for independence, but for the soul of the continent itself.